When she showed up for a job interview, the woman saw a photo of her mother in a black frame in the Millionaire'S office. What she said left him speechless. Madeline's alarm buzzed incessantly, pulling her from a restless sleep. She blinked groggily at the small clock on her nightstand, then let out a sigh. Another early morning, another long day ahead. As she shuffled out of bed, she caught a glimpse of her grandmother's room. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack she could see the gentle rise and fall of her grandmother's frail chest. The rhythmic breathing brought Madeline a small sense of comfort. No matter how hard things got, she always found solace in knowing her grandmother was still there, still fighting. After quickly dressing in a simple blouse and slacks, she tiptoed into the kitchen. The coffee machine sputtered as it brewed, filling the tiny apartment with a faint aroma that helped ease her nerves. Today was an important day. She had been invited for an interview at Whitman Enterprises, one of the most prestigious companies in the city. She had applied on a whim, never really expecting to get a response, but when she received the call, her heart had nearly stopped. As she sipped her coffee, she couldn't help but think about how much this opportunity could change everything. Money had always been tight, especially with her grandmother's mounting medical bills. The old woman had been the only family Madeline had left since her mother's death when she was just a child. The thought of finally being able to provide better care for her grandmother made Madeline's heart swell with hope. She glanced at the small photograph on the refrigerator. It was an old, slightly faded picture of her mother, smiling brightly as she held a much younger Madeline in her arms. "I hope you're watching over me today, Mom," she whispered. "I could really use a bit of your luck." The ride to Whitman Enterprises was nerve-wracking. Madeline had never been to that part of town before, where the buildings seemed to touch the sky, and the streets were lined with luxury cars. She could feel herself shrinking as she walked through the glass doors of the towering building, clutching her resume tightly in her hands. The lobby was vast, with marble floors that seemed to stretch on forever, and large windows that let in the morning light. Everything about the place screamed success, and Madeline felt distinctly out of place. She was directed to the elevator and handed a visitor's badge. Her heart raced as she rode up to the 20th floor. The entire way up, she rehearsed her answers to potential interview questions, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. What if they could tell she didn't belong here? What if they saw right through her? The elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime, and Madeline stepped into a tastefully decorated office space. She was greeted by a receptionist who, with a warm smile, asked her to wait for a few minutes. Madeline took a seat, her hands fidgeting in her lap. As she waited, she glanced around the room, trying to take in her surroundings. The office was elegant and understated, a testament to wealth and power. Her eyes wandered to the large mahogany desk at the far end of the room. That's when she saw it. A photograph in a sleek black frame, resting on the desk. Madeline's breath hitched. The woman in the picture. It couldn't be. She felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized the familiar face. It was her mother. There was no mistaking it. Even after all these years, Madeline would recognize that smile anywhere. She felt her legs go weak, and for a moment she considered running out of the building. But her feet were glued to the floor. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the photograph. Why would Henry Whitman, a man she had never met, have a picture of her mother on his desk? Before she could make sense of it, a door behind the desk opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority that seemed to fill the room. Madeline recognized him immediately from the news article she had seen. Henry Whitman, CEO of Whitman Enterprises. "Madeline, right," he said, extending a hand as he approached her. "Thank you for coming in today." Madeline quickly stood, her mind still reeling from the sight of the photograph. She shook his hand, hoping he wouldn't notice how clammy her palms had become. "Yes, thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Whitman. Please, call me Henry," he said, giving her a polite smile. "Let's get started, shall we?" As he gestured for her to sit, Madeline's eyes flickered back to the photograph on his desk. She had so many questions swirling in her head, but this was an interview. She had to focus, no matter how much her heart was pounding. For now, she had to push the picture out of her mind and get through the next hour. Henry began with the usual questions, asking about her background, her experience, her skills. Madeline answered as best as she could, trying to keep her voice steady, but she could tell he wasn't entirely focused on her answers. He seemed distracted, as if he was thinking about something else. Then, without warning, he shifted the conversation. "Madeline, I hope you don't mind me asking, but where did you grow up?" The question caught her off guard. Mostly with my grandmother," she said. "My mother passed away when I was a child." Henry's eyes softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. And your father?" "I never knew him," Madeline replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother never talked about him." Henry was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said finally, his voice low. "There's something I need to tell you, but I'm not sure how to say it." Madeline's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she didn't dare interrupt. Henry took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "That photograph on my desk, the woman in it was someone I loved deeply, a long time ago." Madeline felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. Her mother, loved by this man. It didn't make any sense. "That's my mother," she said, her voice barely audible. "She died 20 years ago." Henry's eyes widened, and he leaned back in his chair, clearly stunned. For a moment, the room was completely silent, and then he whispered, "I think we need to have a different kind of conversation, Madeline." Henry's words hung heavy in the air, and Madeline felt like she was drowning in a sea of confusion. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she tried to make sense of what he had just said. There was no mistaking the sincerity in his voice, but it made everything all the more bewildering. How could this man have known her mother? Why would he have a picture of her on his desk? She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but the words seemed trapped in her throat. Henry sat back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. It was as if he was seeing a ghost. "I know this must be shocking for you," he said gently. "Believe me, it's just as shocking for me. But I need to explain, and I owe you the truth." Madeline felt a rush of emotions, fear, curiosity, and a flicker of hope. She nodded, trying to keep herself composed, but she could already feel her hands trembling. "Please, tell me," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry took a deep breath, his eyes softening as he began. "Your mother. Her name was Amelia, wasn't it?" Madeline nodded, and he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Amelia and I met over 20 years ago. She was one of the kindest, most beautiful souls I'd ever known. We were very much in love." Madeline's breath hitched, and her mind raced. She had always known her mother as a gentle, loving woman who had worked hard to provide for her. But she had never spoken about any relationships, certainly not about someone as significant as this. "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "If you knew my mother, why didn't she ever mention you?" Henry's expression tightened, and he seemed to struggle with the words. "Because we were forced apart," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "It was not by choice. Circumstances, certain people, made sure that we couldn't be together." Madeline's heart ached as she saw the pain in his eyes. This wasn't just about business or an old flame. There was something much deeper at play. "But how?" she pressed, leaning forward. "What happened?" Henry hesitated, as if unsure how much to reveal. "We had planned to build a life together," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "But then, everything fell apart. I received a letter one day, supposedly from her, saying she was leaving, that she didn't love me anymore, and I should never try to find her." Madeline's eyes widened. "That doesn't sound like my mother at all." She would never have done something like that. I know, Henry said, nodding. I never believed it, but I was young and I was devastated. I thought maybe I had done something to push her away. It wasn't until much later that I found out. The letter was fake. Madeline felt a chill run down her spine. Fake? But who would do something like that? Henry's jaw clenched, and for a moment, a flicker of anger crossed his features. I thought it was one of my rivals, he said. Someone who didn't want me to be distracted by love when there was business to be done. But now, I'm not so sure. Madeline's mind was reeling. It was as if the pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know existed were slowly coming together, but the picture was still unclear. You said you thought it was a rival, she said, carefully, but now you're not sure. Henry nodded. Yes, over the years I tried to move on, but I could never quite let go of her. When I heard she had passed away, it felt like my heart broke all over again. I thought I would never have the chance to find out what really happened. Until today. Until I met you. Madeline's eyes met his, and she saw something there she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. This man, who seemed so powerful and in control, was bearing a part of himself that had clearly been hidden away for years. Why do you have her picture on your desk? She asked, her voice softer now. Why now, after all this time? Henry's gaze dropped to the photograph, and he reached out, gently brushing his fingers over the frame. Because I've been trying to find closure, he said. I've had it there for years, as a reminder of what I lost. But seeing you today, it feels like she's come back to me, like a part of her is still here. Madeline didn't know what to say. She had come here for a job interview, and now she was sitting across from a man who had apparently been in love with her mother. A man who might be the missing piece of a past she never fully understood. You said circumstances kept you apart, she said, her voice barely steady. What circumstances? Henry hesitated, his eyes darkening slightly. There were forces at play, he said carefully. People who wanted to make sure Amelia and I would never see each other again. I had my suspicions back then, but I could never prove anything. Now, I think I may have been right. Madeline's heart was pounding. This was more than just a story of lost love. It was starting to sound like a conspiracy. What do you mean? She asked, leaning forward. Are you saying someone kept you apart on purpose? Henry nodded slowly. Yes, I believe someone manipulated us, forced her away from me, and covered their tracks. I've spent years trying to figure out who it could have been, but every time I got close, something would happen to throw me off. And then, I heard about the accident. Madeline's breath hitched. The accident, the car crash that had taken her mother's life. You think the accident wasn't? Henry met her eyes, and there was a heaviness in his gaze. I don't think it was an accident, he said quietly. I think it was planned. Madeline felt the world tilt. She had grown up believing her mother's death was a tragic but random event. The idea that it could have been orchestrated, that someone had deliberately caused it, was almost too much to bear. Why would anyone? She began, but her voice faltered. I don't know, Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I intend to find out, and now that I know you're her daughter, that you're my daughter, I owe it to both of you to get to the truth. Madeline's mind was spinning. Your daughter? The words felt strange on her tongue. You think I'm your daughter? I know it, Henry said softly, his eyes searching hers. It all makes sense now. The timing, the way you look, you have her eyes. Madeline, I see so much of her in you. I never had any children, and now I understand why. Because she was carrying you when we were torn apart. Madeline's head was swirling with emotions, confusion, fear, disbelief, but also a strange, inexplicable sense of belonging. This "This is all too much," she said, trying to catch her breath. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Henry said gently. "I know this is a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to process it all at once. But I want to help you, and I want to find out what really happened to your mother. I couldn't do it back then, but maybe we can do it together now." Madeline felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. She didn't know whether to be angry or relieved, but she knew one thing for certain. She wanted answers. "I want to know the truth," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "If someone did this to my mother, I want to know who, and I want to make sure they pay for it." Henry nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "Then we'll do it together, no matter what it takes." Madeline left Whitman Enterprises that day with her head spinning. The world outside seemed the same. The bustling city streets, the hum of traffic, the sun casting its warm glow over the buildings. But inside, everything had changed. She had walked into that office expecting nothing more than a job interview, but she had walked out with a possible father, a mystery to solve, and a flood of emotions she hadn't even begun to understand. She barely remembered the bus ride back to her apartment. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess, replaying every word Henry had said. Could it be true? The idea that this man she had never known, this successful CEO, was her father felt surreal. It was like a plot twist from a movie she'd seen 1,000 times but never imagined she'd be living. When she finally reached her apartment, she was greeted by the familiar scent of home-cooked stew. Her grandmother, a small, frail woman with a gentle smile, was stirring a pot on the stove. "You're back, dear," she said, turning to look at Madeline. "How was the interview?" Madeline hesitated, unsure of how to even begin explaining what had happened. "It was different," she said, setting her bag down. "Grandma, can we talk?" Her grandmother's smile faded as she saw the seriousness in Madeline's eyes. She turned off the stove and motioned for them to sit at the small kitchen table. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" Madeline took a deep breath. "I met a man today. His name is Henry Whitman, and he knew Mom. He says he was in love with her, and they were separated, before I was born." Her grandmother's eyes widened, and she seemed to freeze for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. "Henry Whitman," she repeated, almost as if she was testing the name on her tongue. "I remember hearing that name once, a long time ago. Your mother mentioned it, but she never said much." Madeline felt a jolt of curiosity. What did she say? "She was sad," her grandmother said, her eyes distant, as if recalling a memory long buried. "She said he was a good man, but that things didn't work out. She never wanted to talk about it again after that." Madeline's heart clenched. "Grandma, Henry, he thinks he's my father." The room went silent. Her grandmother's face softened, and she reached out to take Madeline's hand. "Oh, sweetie, I always wondered. Your mother never told me the whole story, but I had my suspicions. She was so secretive about that part of her life, and I never understood why. I wish I had pushed her more to tell me." Madeline felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "He said he never knew she was pregnant, that they were separated because of a fake letter. He thinks someone wanted to keep them apart." Her grandmother's expression darkened. "That poor girl, she always seemed like she was carrying a heavy burden. I tried to get her to open up, but she just smiled and said everything would be fine. I never imagined—" "I'm so sorry, Madeline. I should have asked more questions." Madeline squeezed her grandmother's hand, feeling a surge of determination. "It's not your fault, Grandma, but I want to find out what really happened. Henry said he wants to help. He thinks someone was behind Mom's accident, that it wasn't just an accident." Her grandmother's eyes widened in shock. "But that's impossible, isn't it? How could anyone—" "I don't know." Madeline said, shaking her head. But if there's even a chance that it's true, I need to find out. I need to know why she never got to tell me who my father was. I can't keep living with these unanswered questions. Her grandmother nodded, though her eyes were filled with concern. Just be careful, dear. Digging into the past can be dangerous. Sometimes there are things people don't want to be found. Madeline understood the warning, but she had already made up her mind. She couldn't ignore this. Not now. I will, Grandma, she said softly. But I have to do this. The next morning, Madeline found herself standing in front of Whitman Enterprises again, this time with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. She had barely slept, her mind too busy sorting through the revelations from the day before, but she was ready. She needed answers, and Henry was the key to getting them. When she stepped into Henry's office, he was already waiting for her. The look on his face was different today, more serious, almost as if he had been preparing himself for whatever was about to happen. Madeline, he said, standing up and offering a small, tentative smile. I'm glad you came back. I know this must be overwhelming. Madeline nodded, taking a seat across from him. I have questions, and I need you to be honest with me. Completely honest. Of course, Henry said, his expression sincere. Ask me anything. Madeline took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. You said someone sent you a fake letter, pretending it was from my mom. Do you have any idea who could have done that? Henry hesitated, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. I have my suspicions, he said finally. At the time, I thought it was a business rival, someone who wanted me to be focused solely on my work and not distracted by love. But after seeing you, and realizing everything I didn't know, I'm not sure anymore. Madeline's brow furrowed. What do you mean? I mean there are too many coincidences, he said, leaning forward. Your mother's sudden departure, the letter, and then the accident. It's all too convenient. I've spent years trying to put the pieces together, but every lead I followed seemed to hit a dead end. I thought I was being paranoid, but now I'm starting to think I wasn't looking in the right place. Madeline felt a chill. What are you saying? I'm saying that whoever wanted to keep us apart didn't just want to ruin my life, Henry said, his voice growing firmer. They wanted to erase any possibility of us reconnecting, and if they were willing to go that far, I fear they may have had a hand in what happened to your mother. Madeline's hands clenched into fists. Then we need to find out who it was. I can't just sit back and do nothing. Henry's eyes met hers, and she could see a determination there that matched her own. I agree. But we have to be careful. Whoever did this was willing to go to great lengths to cover their tracks, and if they realize we're digging, they won't be happy about it. Madeline swallowed hard, but she nodded. I understand, but I'm not afraid. If someone did this to her, if they hurt my mother, I want them to pay. Henry smiled, though it was a sad, weary smile. You're so much like her, he said softly. She was always so brave, even when things were tough. Madeline felt a lump form in her throat. She had heard stories of her mother's kindness and strength, but to hear it from someone who had loved her, it made everything feel more real, more painful. What do we do next? She asked, her voice barely steady. We start by retracing her last days, Henry said, his tone turning businesslike. I want to see if there's anything we missed back then. A clue, a detail that didn't make sense. I've kept all the old files and notes from my investigation, and I'll share them with you. Maybe there's something we overlooked. Madeline nodded, grateful for his willingness to involve her. Okay, let's do it. As they began to discuss their plan, she felt a strange sense of unity. It was still surreal to think of him as her father, but there was a part of her that wanted to believe it, that wanted to find a connection to the past she had lost. But as she left his office that day, one thought kept echoing in her mind. If someone had gone to such great lengths to keep them apart, there had to be a reason. And whatever it was, she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The next few days passed in a blur as Madeline and Henry began their investigation in earnest. Henry provided her with stacks of documents, old letters, and newspaper clippings. Each evening after work, Madeline would sift through the materials, searching for anything that might hint at the truth. It was overwhelming, and at times, she felt like she was drowning in a sea of dead ends and half-truths. But Henry's determination kept her going. One evening, as they sat in Henry's office and surrounded by papers, Madeline found herself glancing at the photograph of her mother again. It was a beautiful picture, taken in what looked like a garden, with her mother smiling warmly at the camera. The sight of it filled Madeline with a mix of sadness and longing. "When was this photo taken?" she asked, her voice soft. Henry looked up from the file he was reading and followed her gaze. "That was taken the last time we were together," he said quietly. "We had spent the day at a park just outside the city. I remember thinking it was one of the happiest days of my life." He paused, his eyes distant. "I had no idea it would be one of the last." Madeline felt a pang in her chest. "She looks so happy," she said almost to herself. "She was," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "At least I thought she was. But then she disappeared, and everything changed." Madeline didn't know what to say. She had grown up with so many questions about her mother, and now she had even more. But she also felt a strange comfort in knowing that there was someone else who had loved her as much as she did. "We'll find out what happened," she said, more for herself than for him. "We have to." Henry nodded, his expression resolute. "I believe we will, but it won't be easy. There are people who went to great lengths to make sure the truth was buried, and they won't let it come to light without a fight." As the evening wore on, they continued to dig through the documents, but it felt like they were getting nowhere. Madeline could sense the frustration building within her, and she was about to suggest calling it a night when she noticed something odd. One of the letters Henry had received, supposedly from her mother, was dated only a week before her death. The handwriting was neat, but there was something about it that didn't seem quite right. "Henry, look at this," she said, handing him the letter. "Do you see anything strange?" Henry took the letter and studied it, his brow furrowing. "It's her handwriting," he said, though he sounded uncertain. "But," Madeline pointed to the signature, "it doesn't match. I remember how she used to sign her name on my school forms, and this, it looks similar, but it's not the same." Henry's eyes widened as he looked closer. "You're right," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I can't believe I didn't notice this before." Madeline's heart raced. "Do you think someone forged it?" "It's possible," Henry said, his mind clearly racing with possibilities. "But if that's true, it means someone was trying to manipulate her actions, even right up until her death. We need to find out who could have had access to her and why they would do this." Madeline's stomach twisted with a mix of fear and anger. "Do you think this has something to do with the accident?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "I don't know," Henry said, but there was a grim look on his face. "But it's starting to feel like everything is connected. We need to follow this lead and see where it takes us." Over the next few days, Madeline and Henry began to focus their investigation on the days leading up to her mother's death. They scoured through old records, looking for anyone who might have had a reason to forge the letter or interfere with her life. It was exhausting work, and the more they dug, the more questions they seemed to uncover. One night, after another long day of searching, Henry decided to take Madeline to a place he hadn't been in years. "I want to show you something," he said as they left the office. "It might help you understand why this is so important to me." They drove to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, and soon they pulled up in front of a small, charming house. The garden was overgrown, and the paint on the shutters was peeling, but there was a sense of warmth to the place, even in its disrepair. "This was where we were going to live," Henry said as they stepped out of the car. "Your mother and I bought it together. We plan to fix it up, make it our home." Madeline's heart ached as she looked at the house. She could almost picture her mother there, planting flowers in the garden or sitting on the porch, enjoying a cup of tea. "I had no idea," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never got to move in," Henry continued, his eyes distant. "After she left, I couldn't bring myself to come back here, but I kept the house, even though it was painful, because it was all I had left of her. I thought maybe, one day, I'd find out why she left. And now, I finally have a chance to understand." Madeline felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you for showing me this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It means a lot." Henry nodded, and for a moment, they stood there in silence, both lost in their thoughts. "There's one more thing," he said finally, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, weathered key. "I want you to have this. It's the key to the house. If you ever need a place to think or just be closer to her, it's yours." Madeline took the key, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't know what to say," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "You don't have to say anything," Henry said gently. "I'm just glad you're here, and I promise we'll get to the bottom of this, whatever it takes." The next morning, Henry received a call that would change everything. One of his old contacts, a private investigator he had hired years ago, had found something. "Henry, I'm not sure what to make of this, but I think you should see it for yourself," the man said. "I dug up some old records, and there's a name that keeps coming up. Someone who had connections to Amelia's life around the time of her death." Henry's pulse quickened. "Who?" "The name is Malcolm Warren," the investigator said. "He was a business associate of yours, wasn't he?" Henry's heart dropped. Malcolm Warren had been more than just a business associate. He had been a close friend, someone he had trusted implicitly. "Yes, he was," Henry said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What does he have to do with this?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," the investigator admitted. "But there are some strange financial transactions between him and a few other parties around the time of Amelia's death. It looks like someone was being paid to keep quiet about something." Henry's mind raced. Could Malcolm have been involved in the conspiracy that tore him and Amelia apart? It seemed unthinkable, but the pieces were starting to fit together. "Thank you," he said to the investigator. "Keep digging. I need to know everything." After he hung up, Henry turned to Madeline, who had been listening intently. "We might have a lead," he said, his voice taut with tension. "But if Malcolm was involved, this is going to get a lot more complicated." Madeline could see the pain in his eyes, but she felt a surge of determination. "Then we'll figure it out," she said, her voice firm, "whatever it takes." Henry nodded, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "You remind me so much of her," he said quietly. "Your strength, your courage. She would be so proud of you." Madeline felt her heart swell, but she pushed the emotion aside. There would be time for that later. For now, they had a new lead to follow, and she was ready to do whatever it took to find the truth, even if it meant confronting a man who had once been a trusted friend of her newly discovered father. The next few days were a whirlwind as Madeline and Henry prepared to confront the possibility that Malcolm Warren, a man Henry once trusted, might be involved in the conspiracy that led to Amelia's death. The idea was almost too painful for Henry to accept, but he knew they had to follow this lead, no matter how difficult it was. Henry arranged a meeting with Malcolm at a quiet, upscale cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was a place where they used to have business lunches, but this time the atmosphere felt different, charged with an unspoken tension. As they arrived, Henry glanced at Madeline, who was sitting beside him in the car, her face set with a mixture of determination and anxiety. "You don't have to be here for this," he said gently, though he knew she wouldn't back down. I can handle Malcolm on my own. Madeline shook her head. I want to be here, she said firmly. I need to see this through. Henry nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. All right, let's go. They stepped out of the car and entered the cafe where Malcolm was already waiting at a table by the window. He stood up when he saw them, a warm smile spreading across his face. Henry, it's been too long, he said, extending his hand. And this must be Madeline. I've heard a lot about you. Madeline shook his hand, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. Nice to meet you, she said, her tone polite but guarded. Henry forced a smile, though his mind was racing. Yes, it has been a while, Malcolm, he said, taking a seat. I'm glad you could make time to see us. Of course, Malcolm said, still smiling as he sat down. What's on your mind? Henry took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I need to ask you about something that happened a long time ago, he began, his eyes fixed on Malcolm's. Something involving Amelia. For a brief moment, Malcolm's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. Amelia? He said, feigning confusion. I'm not sure I understand. I think you do, Henry said, his voice low and steady. I know about the letters, the ones that were sent to me, supposedly from her, telling me to stay away. And I know that someone was paying people to keep quiet about what happened around the time of her death. I need to know if you had anything to do with it. Malcolm's eyes flickered, and Madeline could see a brief flash of something. Surprise, maybe, or fear. But then he laughed, a sound that felt forced and hollow. Henry, this was years ago, he said, shaking his head. Why are you bringing this up now? Whatever happened back then, it's in the past. Because it's not just the past, Henry said, his voice growing sharper. It's about my daughter's mother. And it's about the fact that I was lied to, manipulated, and kept away from the woman I loved. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you have anything to do with it? The tension at the table was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed as if Malcolm was going to deny everything. But then he sighed, and the smile faded from his face. Henry, you don't want to go down this road, he said quietly. Sometimes the truth isn't worth the trouble it brings. Madeline felt a surge of anger. What do you mean by that? She demanded, her voice shaking. If you know something, you need to tell us. Malcolm looked at her, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. I'm sorry, Madeline, he said softly. But there are things you don't understand, things that can't be undone. Henry's patience snapped. Enough with the vague answers, Malcolm, he said, his voice rising. I trusted you. If you had anything to do with what happened to Amelia, I deserve to know. Malcolm sighed again, his shoulders slumping. All right, he said, his voice barely audible. I'll tell you, but you're not going to like it. Malcolm's confession came out slowly, as if every word was a struggle. He explained how, years ago, he had been approached by another business associate, someone with connections to Henry's rivals. This person had proposed a deal. If Malcolm helped drive a wedge between Henry and Amelia, he would receive a lucrative business opportunity in return. At the time, Malcolm hadn't thought much of it. He had seen it as a way to secure his own future, not realizing the full extent of what he was getting involved in. The letter wasn't my idea, Malcolm said, his voice hollow. But I delivered it. I was the one who made sure it got to you, Henry. I didn't know it would lead to what happened. Madeline felt like she had been punched in the gut. You're saying you helped them separate my parents, she said, her voice barely steady. And you never thought to tell anyone. I thought it was just business, Malcolm said, sounding almost defensive. I didn't know it would end like this. I was young, stupid, and greedy. I made a mistake, and I've had to live with it ever since. Henry's hands clenched into fists. Do you know who was behind it? He asked, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. Who orchestrated the whole thing? Malcolm hesitated, glancing nervously around the cafe. "I don't know his real name," he said finally. "I only knew him by his alias, Gray. He was connected, powerful. The kind of man you don't cross if you want to keep your life intact. I haven't heard from him in years." Madeline exchanged a look with Henry. This was the first time they had heard of anyone referred to as Gray, but it was a lead. "We need to find out who he is," she said, her voice filled with determination. "If he was involved in separating you and my mother, then he might have been behind her death, too." Henry nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Thank you for telling us, Malcolm," he said, though there was no warmth in his voice. "But this isn't over." Malcolm's face tightened, and he looked genuinely frightened. "I've told you everything I know," he said, his voice shaky. "But if you're planning to dig into this, be careful. Gray doesn't leave loose ends. If he finds out you're looking for him, he won't hesitate to silence you." That night, Henry and Madeline sat together in his office, trying to make sense of everything they had learned. The revelation that Malcolm had been involved was painful, but it had also given them a new direction. Now they had a name, even if it was just an alias. Gray. "Do you think Malcolm was telling the truth?" Madeline asked, her brow furrowed. "Or was he just trying to throw us off?" "I believe he was telling the truth," Henry said, though there was a weariness in his voice. He had nothing to gain by lying at this point, and the fear in his eyes, that was real. Whoever this Gray is, he must be dangerous. Madeline felt a shiver run down her spine. "Then we need to be smart about this," she said. "We can't just start asking questions. We need to find out who Gray is without drawing too much attention to ourselves." Henry nodded. "Agreed. I'll reach out to some contacts, discreetly. There are still people who owe me favors, and I'm sure one of them might have heard of this Gray. But you need to promise me something. Madeline." "What is it?" she asked, looking up at him. "If things start to get dangerous, you have to walk away," he said, his eyes serious. "I don't want you getting hurt because of my past." Madeline shook her head. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "This is my fight, too. Whoever did this took my mother away from me, and I'm not going to let them get away with it." Henry saw the determination in her eyes and knew there was no point in arguing. "All right," he said softly. "We'll do this together, but we have to be careful. Whoever Gray is, he's not going to let us find him without a fight." As they sat there, making plans and strategizing, Madeline felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, she was getting closer to the truth about her mother, and she had Henry by her side. But she also knew that they were stepping into dangerous territory, and there was no telling what they might uncover. Whatever happened next, she was ready. She had spent her whole life with unanswered questions, and now she was finally getting the chance to find the answers she had been searching for, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. Over the following week, Henry and Madeline worked tirelessly, discreetly following leads and reaching out to Henry's old contacts. Every clue they uncovered seemed to lead them further down a dark and tangled path. But one thing was clear. Whoever this mysterious Gray was, he had been pulling strings from behind the scenes for a long time. Henry was careful about who he contacted, knowing that even a hint of what they were investigating could alert the wrong people. He reached out to former associates, retired business partners, and anyone who might have had dealings with powerful figures during the time he and Amelia were separated. Despite his efforts, information on Gray was scarce, almost as if he was a ghost who left no trace. Madeline, meanwhile, tried to keep her own life as normal as possible. She continued to care for her grandmother, making sure to check in on her every day, even as she spent long hours sifting through old records and documents. She was exhausted, but she couldn't stop now, not when they were finally making progress. One afternoon, as she was about to head to Henry's office, she received a call from him. His voice was urgent, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. "Madeline, I need you to come to my office right away," he said. "I think we've got something." Madeline's heart leaped into her throat. "I'm on my way," she said, grabbing her bag and rushing out the door. When she arrived, Henry was pacing in his office, a mix of excitement and anxiety on his face. "What happened?" she asked, her voice breathless from rushing up the stairs. "I got a call from one of my contacts," Henry said, stopping to face her. "Someone who used to work in security for one of my old rivals. He heard about our inquiries and reached out to me. Apparently, he knew Gray, or at least knew of him." Madeline's eyes widened. "What did he say?" Henry took a deep breath, as if steadying himself. He said that Gray was a code name used by a man who operated as a sort of fixer, someone who would handle problems for powerful people, usually behind the scenes. But here's the thing. Gray wasn't just any fixer. He was known for making problems disappear, permanently. If someone needed to be silenced, or if a situation needed to be resolved quietly, Gray was the man they called. Madeline felt a chill run down her spine. "You mean, like arranging accidents?" Henry nodded grimly. "Exactly, and it gets worse. My contact said that Gray's clients weren't just business people. He had connections to law enforcement, politics, even the media. That's why he was so hard to track down. He had people in high places protecting him." Madeline's mind raced as she processed what Henry was saying. "Do you think he was the one behind my mother's accident?" "It's starting to look that way," Henry said, his voice tight. "But there's something else. My contact mentioned that Gray was known to operate out of a private club downtown. It's a place where the city's elite go to conduct business away from prying eyes. If we want to find out more, that's where we need to start." Madeline's heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination. "Then that's where we'll go," she said. "We have to find him. Henry." Henry looked at her, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "It's dangerous, Madeline. If we're right, and this man was involved in what happened to Amelia, then he won't think twice about hurting anyone who gets too close to the truth. We're walking into the lion's den." "I know," Madeline said, her voice steady. "But I'm not backing down, not now." Henry nodded, though he still looked uneasy. "All right, but we need to be smart about this. We can't just walk in and start asking questions. We need a plan." Later that evening, Henry and Madeline sat in his office, discussing their next move. Henry explained that the club was members only, and they couldn't just waltz in without an invitation. Fortunately, one of Henry's acquaintances, a man named Victor, was a member. Henry called him and arranged to meet, hoping to secure their entry without raising suspicion. The next day, they met Victor at a quiet bar across town. He was a tall, imposing man with a neatly trimmed beard and a sharp suit. He greeted Henry warmly, but his eyes flickered with curiosity when he saw Madeline. "So, this is the young lady you mentioned," he said, extending his hand to her. "I'm Victor. Nice to meet you." "Madeline?" she said, shaking his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to help us." Victor smiled, though there was a hint of caution in his eyes. "I'm not sure I'd call it helping just yet," he said. "Henry told me you're looking for information on someone who goes by the name Gray. I have to warn you, that's a dangerous game you're playing. People who ask too many questions about Gray don't usually stick around for long." "We understand the risks," Henry said, his tone firm. "But we need to know. If you can get us into the club, we might be able to find someone who can point us in the right direction." Victor sighed, as if weighing the decision. "I can get you in," he said finally, "but you need to be careful. Don't draw attention to yourselves, and whatever you do, don't mention Gray's name directly. If he's still around, there's a good chance he has eyes and ears in that place." Henry nodded. "Understood. We'll be discreet." "Good," Victor said, finishing his drink. "I'll make the arrangements. You'll be my guests. But after that, you're on your own. I can't promise to keep you safe if things go south." The club was as opulent as Madeline had imagined, with dark wood paneling, leather armchairs, and a bar that gleamed under the dim, warm lights. It was the kind of place where the city's most powerful people came to relax and negotiate deals that would never be discussed in boardrooms. Victor led them inside, giving a nod to the bouncer at the door. "Try to blend in," he murmured to Madeline and Henry as they walked through the main hall. "You're just here for drinks, nothing more." They settled into a corner booth, their eyes scanning the room. Madeline felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Every face around her looked composed, almost bored, but she knew that behind those calm expressions were people who could destroy lives with a single word. She couldn't help but wonder how many of them had known her mother, how many had played a part in the events that had led to her death. As they sipped their drinks, a man approached their table. He was tall and thin, with sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Henry Whitman," he said, a smile curling on his lips. "It's been a while." Henry looked up, his expression guarded. "James, yes, it has." James glanced at Madeline, his smile widening. "And who is this lovely young lady?" "This is my daughter, Madeline," Henry said, his tone even. "She's here with me tonight." James's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he quickly masked it with a chuckle. "I didn't know you had a daughter, Henry. But then, there are a lot of things I don't know about you, aren't there?" Madeline's heart skipped a beat. There was something unsettling about the way James looked at her, as if he was trying to read her thoughts. "Nice to meet you," she said, forcing a polite smile. "The pleasure is mine," James said, though his eyes never left hers. "You know, Henry, it's been a while since I've seen you around these parts. What brings you back?" "Just catching up with old friends," Henry said smoothly. "It's always nice to reconnect." James's smile remained, but there was a glint of suspicion in his eyes. "Well, I hope you enjoy your evening," he said, finally turning to leave. "And if you're looking for anything specific, just let me know. I can always point you in the right direction." As soon as he was out of earshot, Madeline leaned closer to Henry. "Who was that?" she whispered. "James is someone who knows things," Henry said, his voice low. "If anyone here has information on Gray, it's him. But we need to be careful. He's also the type to sell you out if it benefits him." Madeline's mind was spinning. "Do you think he suspects something?" "I don't know," Henry said, his eyes scanning the room. "But we need to find out what he knows. And if he really can point us in the right direction, we have to take that chance." As they sat there, trying to decide their next move, Madeline couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around, but the faces in the club were unreadable, their conversations low and controlled. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of what they were up against. Gray wasn't just a person. He was a shadow that lingered over everything, and if they weren't careful, he could swallow them whole. But Madeline wasn't going to let fear stop her. She had come too far, and she wasn't about to back down now. Whatever secrets this place held, she was going to find them, and she was going to make sure the truth about her mother finally came to light. Henry and Madeline left the club that night feeling more uncertain than ever. Their brief interaction with James had left them with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. If they wanted to learn more about Gray, they would have to play his game, and that meant taking risks. The following day, Henry decided to reach out to James directly. They needed information, and he suspected that James E., with his network of connections, could provide it for a price. "I'll handle this," Henry told Madeline as they sat in his office. "James is the kind of person who respects directness, but he also likes to have the upper hand. If we're going to get anything out of him, we need to approach carefully." Madeline's instincts told her that this was a bad idea, but she trusted Henry's judgment. "Just be careful," she said. "I don't trust him." "I don't either," Henry admitted, "but we're running out of options. If we don't get a lead soon, this trail could go cold, and we might never find out who Gray is." Later that afternoon, Henry arranged to meet James at a small, discreet restaurant on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where people went when they didn't want to be seen, and James had suggested it himself, which made Henry uneasy. But he had no other choice. When James arrived, he was dressed impeccably, as always, with a casual yet calculated air. "Henry?" he said, sliding into the booth across from him. "I have to say, I'm intrigued. What exactly are you looking for?" Henry leaned back, keeping his expression neutral. "Information," he said simply. "I need to know about Gray, who he is, where he operates, and how I can find him." James chuckled, as if Henry had just told him a joke. "Ah, straight to the point. I admire that. But you have to understand, information like that doesn't come cheap." "I'm willing to pay," Henry said, his eyes steady. "Name your price." James's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, it's not about money, Henry. It's about leverage. You see, people like Gray, they operate in shadows, and those shadows are protected by very powerful people. If I give you what you're asking for, I'm risking a lot. So tell me, why should I do that for you?" Henry hesitated for a moment, considering his next words carefully. "Because this isn't just about business," he said finally. "It's personal. I want to know why Amelia was taken from me, and I want to know who was responsible. If Gray was involved, then I'm going to make sure he answers for it." James's eyes darkened slightly. "Amelia," he said, as if tasting the name. "Yes, I remember her. Lovely woman. It's a shame what happened to her." Henry's jaw tightened. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving Henry's. "You know, Henry, you're digging up things that were meant to stay buried. Gray has been around for a long time, and he's very good at what he does. If you're looking for justice, you're going to be disappointed." "I'm not looking for justice," Henry said, his voice cold. "I'm looking for the truth." James sighed, setting his glass down. "Very well, I can point you in the right direction. But you need to understand that this will come at a cost. Gray doesn't like to be found, and if he senses you're getting close, he will make sure you regret it." "I'll take my chances," Henry said firmly. "Tell me what you know." James hesitated for a moment, then leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's a warehouse in the industrial district. It's where Gray's people conduct business that can't be traced. If you're looking for answers, that's where you'll find them. But be warned, if you go there, you're not going to find a welcoming committee. And if Gray gets wind of this, he will come after you." Henry nodded, though his heart was pounding. "Thank you," he said. "I'll handle the rest." James's smile returned, but there was something almost pitying about it. "Good luck, Henry. You're going to need it." When Henry relayed the information to Madeline, she was immediately concerned. "A warehouse? This sounds like a trap," she said. "What if Gray knows we're coming?" "He might," Henry admitted. "But we don't have much of a choice. If James is telling the truth, this could be our best chance to find out more about who Gray really is." Madeline's mind was racing. She wanted answers as much as Henry did, but the thought of walking into an unknown situation without a clear plan terrified her. "We need backup," she said. "We can't just go there without knowing what we're walking into." "I agree," Henry said. "I've already reached out to one of my security contacts. He's discreet, and he can give us some support from a distance. We'll have eyes on the place before we get anywhere near it." Madeline was relieved, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much bigger than they realized. "When do we go?" "Tomorrow night," Henry said. "That's when the activity at the warehouse is usually busiest. We'll blend in with the traffic and get close enough to see what's going on." The next evening, Madeline and Henry found themselves in a dark, deserted alley across from the warehouse. They had arrived separately to avoid drawing attention, but now they were together, waiting for the signal from Henry's contact. The air was cold, and Madeline's hands shook slightly as she clutched her phone, trying to stay calm. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, glancing at Henry. "We could still turn back." "No," Henry said, his voice resolute. "We need to see this through. If Gray was involved in Amelia's death, then this might be our only chance to prove it." Madeline nodded, swallowing her fear. "Okay, let's do it." A few minutes later, Henry's phone buzzed. It was a message from his contact. Clear for now. 2 guards at the entrance, but no sign of Gray. Looks like we're good to go, Henry said, showing the message to Madeline. Let's move. They approached the warehouse cautiously, sticking to the shadows. As they got closer, they could hear voices coming from inside, muffled by the thick walls. The building was large and imposing, with a few scattered lights casting eerie shadows across the ground. Henry led the way to a side entrance, where they could slip in without being seen. The door was unlocked, and they quietly pushed it open, slipping inside. The interior of the warehouse was dark, with narrow beams of light cutting through the gloom. Stacks of crates lined the walls, and the air smelled of oil and dust. They moved silently, listening for any signs of movement. As they made their way deeper into the building, they could hear faint murmurs of conversation coming from a room at the far end. Henry motioned for Madeline to follow, and they crept closer, straining to hear what was being said. "A shipment will be ready by next week," a voice said, barely audible. "Make sure it gets to the dock without any issues." "Understood," another voice replied. "And what about the Whitman situation? Should we be concerned?" Madeline's heart stopped. They were talking about Henry. "Not yet," the first voice said. "Gray hasn't given any orders, but if they keep poking around, we'll have to take care of it." Henry's eyes met Madeline's, and she could see the alarm in them. They were being watched, and whoever was behind this was already planning their next move. "We need to get out of here," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. "Now." But just as they turned to leave, they heard the sound of a door opening behind them. They froze, their hearts pounding, as footsteps echoed through the warehouse. A tall, shadowy figure stepped into view, and Madeline felt a wave of fear wash over her as she realized who it was. It was James. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I have to say, I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd actually have the guts to show up here." Henry's hands clenched into fists. "You set us up." James shrugged, his smile widening. "Of course I did. You're not the only one who knows how to play the game, Henry. But don't worry, you're not leaving empty-handed. I have a message for you. From Gray." Before Henry or Madeline could react, 2 men stepped out of the shadows behind James, blocking their escape. "You've been asking too many questions, Henry," James said, his tone suddenly cold. "And Gray doesn't like that. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop digging. You're going to walk away. Because if you don't, well, let's just say your little reunion with your daughter won't last much longer." Madeline's blood ran cold. She could see the seriousness in James's eyes, and she knew he wasn't bluffing. "We're not afraid of you," she said, though her voice shook. James laughed. "Maybe not now, but you will be." As he turned to leave, he glanced back at Henry one last time. "Consider this your last warning, Henry. If you want to stay alive, you'll keep your nose out of Gray's business. Because the next time we meet, I won't be so generous." Henry and Madeline stood frozen, their minds racing. They had come looking for answers, but all they had found was a new layer of threats. And now, they knew one thing for certain. Gray was watching them, and he was ready to do whatever it took to keep his secrets hidden. Henry and Madeline left the warehouse that night with their hearts pounding and minds racing. The encounter with James had confirmed their worst fears. They were being watched, and whoever Gray was, he had eyes everywhere. As they drove back to Henry's office in silence, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They had pushed too far, and now they were in serious danger. When they arrived, Henry parked the car and turned to Madeline, his expression grim. "We need to stop, at least for now," he said, his voice low but firm. "Gray has people everywhere, and if we keep pushing, we're going to get hurt, or worse." Madeline stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious," she said. "We're closer than ever. We can't just walk away now." "I know how you feel, Madeline. Henry said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I'm not willing to risk your life. James was right about one thing. Gray doesn't leave loose ends. If we keep digging, he'll come after us, and he won't miss next time." Madeline's hands were trembling, but she clenched them into fists, trying to steady herself. "I'm not afraid of him," she said, her voice resolute. "He took everything from us, from you, from me, from my mother. I'm not going to let him get away with it." Henry felt a mix of pride and fear as he looked at her. She had her mother's spirit, her unyielding strength, and he admired her for it. But he also knew that strength could be dangerous. "Madeline," he said softly, "I've already lost one person I loved because of this. I can't lose you, too." For a moment, Madeline's resolve faltered, but then she took a deep breath and shook her head. "I understand why you're scared," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "But I'm not going to stop. You said you wanted the truth, and so do I. If Gray thinks he can scare us into giving up, he's wrong." Henry sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had spent years trying to find closure, to make peace with the loss of Amelia. But now, standing on the edge of a dangerous conspiracy, he realized that peace would never come unless they saw this through. "All right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to be smart about this. If we're going to keep digging, we can't let Gray know we're still looking. We'll need to move quietly, carefully." Madeline nodded, relief washing over her. "We can do that," she said. "But we need a new plan, something that will let us get close to him without drawing attention." The following day, they began to work on a new approach. Henry had a few trusted contacts who specialized in surveillance and discreet investigations, and he reached out to them, asking for help in tracking down any information on Gray. Meanwhile, Madeline focused on a different angle. She started looking into old newspaper archives, searching for any mention of accidents or incidents that matched the pattern of what had happened to her mother. It was tedious, frustrating work, but it paid off. After several days of searching, Madeline found an article about a car crash that had happened 2 years before Amelia's death. The circumstances were eerily similar: a single-car accident on a quiet road, late at night, with no witnesses. The victim was a businesswoman who had been involved in a legal dispute with a major corporation at the time of her death. Madeline's pulse quickened as she read through the details. There was no direct link to Gray, but the pattern was there. "Henry," she said, rushing into his office with the article, "look at this. Doesn't it sound familiar?" Henry scanned the page, his expression darkening. "It does," he said. "Too familiar. If this is connected to Gray, then it means he's been active for a long time. And if he's willing to eliminate people over business disputes, then there's no telling how far his influence goes." "Which means we need to find someone who knows him," Madeline said. "Someone who's worked with him or seen how he operates. There has to be a way to get closer." Henry thought for a moment. Then his eyes lit up with an idea. James mentioned that Gray had connections to law enforcement, politics, and the media. If we can find someone in those circles who's willing to talk, we might be able to get a lead on him. Madeline's heart skipped a beat. "Do you have anyone in mind?" "There's one person," Henry said, his voice cautious. "A journalist named Alex Mitchell. He's known for investigating corruption and has been digging into the city's underworld for years. If anyone has heard whispers about Gray, it would be him." "Do you trust him?" Madeline asked. "I don't know," Henry admitted. "But he has a reputation for being persistent, and he's not afraid of making enemies. If he's willing to talk, he could be our best chance." That evening, Henry made the call. Alex agreed to meet them at a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place he frequented to avoid being seen by the people he was investigating. When Henry and Madeline arrived, they found him sitting at a booth in the back, nursing a cup of coffee. He was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a tired expression, as if he had seen more than his share of the city's dark side. "Henry Whitman," Alex said as they approached, "I have to say I didn't expect to get a call from you. What's this about?" Henry sat down, with Madeline taking a seat beside him. "We need information," he said bluntly, "about a man who goes by the name Gray." Alex's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't seem surprised. "Gray, huh? That's a dangerous name to be throwing around. What makes you think I know anything about him?" "We're not asking for much," Madeline said, leaning forward. "Just whatever you can tell us. We're trying to find out who he is and why he's been targeting people." Alex studied them for a moment, his expression unreadable. "People who go looking for Gray don't usually come out of it unscathed," he said. "If you're serious about this, you need to understand what you're getting into." "We understand," Henry said, "but we need answers." Alex sighed, as if resigning himself to a decision he didn't want to make. "All right," he said. "I've heard of Gray. He's not a name you hear often, but when you do, it's usually in hushed tones. He's not just some enforcer. He's an operator, someone who makes problems disappear, and he does it in a way that leaves no trace. That's why he's so hard to track." Madeline's heart raced. "Do you know how we can find him?" "I don't," Alex said, shaking his head. "But I've heard rumors about where he operates. There's a private estate on the edge of the city, a place where people go to conduct business away from prying eyes. It's owned by a shell company, but word is, Gray uses it as a base of operations. If you're looking for him, that might be your best shot." Henry's eyes narrowed. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because I've been trying to get close to Gray for years and I've never been able to," Alex said, his tone bitter. "He's untouchable, but if you're crazy enough to try, I figure I might as well point you in the right direction. Just don't expect it to be easy. Gray doesn't take kindly to people poking around his business." Madeline felt a surge of hope. "Thank you, Alex," she said. "We'll be careful." "You'd better be," Alex said, his eyes serious. "Because if Gray finds out you're looking for him, he won't just come after you. He'll make sure you disappear, just like all the others." The private estate was a sprawling mansion surrounded by high walls and security cameras, nestled in a secluded area on the edge of the city. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, and no one saw anything they weren't supposed to. For Henry and Madeline, it was their next destination, and the thought of going there filled them with equal parts dread and determination. They spent the next few days preparing, gathering as much information as they could about the estate and its layout. Henry arranged for a car and disguises that would help them blend in, while Madeline studied maps and planned their approach. They knew this was risky, possibly the most dangerous thing they had ever done, but they were out of options. If they wanted answers, this was their chance to get them. On the night of the operation, they parked the car a short distance from the estate and made their way to a service entrance. The night was cool, and the sky was clouded over, casting everything in a dark, ominous shade. As they approached the gate, Madeline's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself think. "This is it," Henry whispered. "Are you ready?" Madeline nodded, though she could barely breathe. "Yes, let's do this." They slipped through the gate and into the shadows, moving silently along the side of the building. The estate was eerily quiet, with only the occasional distant sound of a car passing by on the nearby road. They crept closer, scanning the windows for any sign of movement, until they reached a side door that led into the mansion. As they stepped inside, they found themselves in a dimly lit hallway, with the faint sound of voices coming from somewhere deeper within the building. Madeline's nerves were on edge, but she forced herself to stay focused. They had to find something, anything, that could lead them to Gray. They made their way down the hallway, careful to avoid making any noise, until they reached a door that was slightly ajar. Henry peered through the crack, and his eyes widened as he saw what was inside. In the room, there were several men sitting around a table, deep in conversation. But it wasn't the men who caught Henry's attention. It was the stack of files on the table, each marked with a different name. One of them had Amelia's name on it. Madeline's heart skipped a beat as she saw the file. "That's it," she whispered. "We need to get that." Henry nodded. But just as he was about to move, the door creaked open, and the men inside turned, their eyes locking onto him and Madeline. There was a moment of stunned silence, and then one of the men stood up, his expression dark and threatening. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Looks like we have some uninvited guests. I wonder how Gray will feel about this." Madeline felt a surge of panic, but she refused to back down. "We're not leaving without those files," she said, her voice shaking but determined. The man's smile widened, and he took a step forward. "I don't think you understand the situation, sweetheart," he said. "You're not leaving at all." As the men closed in, Henry and Madeline knew they were trapped. They had come searching for answers, but now they were about to face the consequences of getting too close to the truth. And somewhere, deep within the shadows of the estate, Gray was waiting, watching, ready to make his move. Henry and Madeline's hearts pounded in their chests as the men closed in on them. The room felt smaller, the air thicker with tension. Madeline's mind raced, searching for a way out, but she knew they were cornered. The men in front of them, their smug expressions and predatory eyes, made it clear they weren't going to let them leave easily, if at all. Henry stepped in front of Madeline protectively, his fists clenched. "You don't want to do this," he warned, his voice calm but filled with barely controlled anger. "We're only here for the truth." The lead man, tall, with a scar running down the side of his face, chuckled darkly. "The truth? You're in the wrong place for that, old man. No one here is interested in the truth. Gray doesn't leave loose ends, and you're looking like a pretty big one right now." Henry knew there was no reasoning with them. They were Gray's people, loyal and ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to take them out. But Henry wasn't about to give up. "Let us walk out of here," he said firmly, "and we won't come back." The scarred man's smile faded, replaced by cold, calculating eyes. "No," he said simply, and with a nod, the men began to advance. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. They were out of time. She grabbed Henry's arm, pulling him back. "We have to run," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. Henry didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing her hand, he bolted for the door behind them, dragging Madeline along as the men shouted and lunged toward them. They sprinted down the narrow hallway, the sound of footsteps pounding behind them. Madeline's heart raced, her legs burning as she struggled to keep up with Henry's long strides. The mansion was a maze of corridors and rooms, and as they turned corner after corner, Madeline realized they had no idea where they were going. "Where's the exit?" she gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "I don't know," Henry said through gritted teeth. "We just have to keep moving." The voices behind them grew louder, closer, and Madeline's stomach twisted with fear. They were being hunted. Every step echoed in the silence of the mansion, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. Henry glanced over his shoulder and saw the men closing the distance. "This way," he urged, spotting a staircase leading down to what looked like a cellar door. They stumbled down the stairs, the narrow space making it difficult to move quickly. Henry yanked the cellar door open, and they ducked inside, slamming it shut behind them. The darkness enveloped them, and for a moment, all they could hear was their own labored breathing. Madeline's heart pounded in her chest, but the momentary reprieve gave her a chance to catch her breath. "What now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the darkness. Henry scanned the room, searching for anything that could help. The cellar was cramped, with low ceilings and dusty shelves filled with old boxes and equipment. There was only one small window near the ceiling, too high and narrow for either of them to escape through. "We'll have to find another way out," he said quietly. Suddenly, the door rattled behind them. The men had found them. "Get ready," Henry muttered, bracing himself against the door. "They'll be through any second." Madeline's heart leaped into her throat. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor, her hands trembling. She wasn't a fighter, but she wasn't about to let them be captured without a struggle. The door burst open, and the first man lunged in, his eyes wild with anger. Henry swung a metal pipe he'd found, catching the man squarely in the chest and sending him sprawling back into the hallway. But before they could react, Another man pushed through, grabbing Henry by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "Henry!" Madeline screamed, rushing toward them. Without thinking, she swung the wooden plank at the man, hitting him in the side. He grunted in pain, but his grip on Henry didn't loosen. Instead, he shoved Henry harder into the wall, pinning him there. "Madeline, run!" Henry shouted, his voice filled with desperation, but Madeline wasn't about to leave him. She raised the plank again, preparing to strike, but the man grabbed her arm before she could swing. His grip was like iron, and she cried out in pain as he twisted her wrist, forcing her to drop the plank. "Enough of this," the man growled, shoving both Henry and Madeline to the floor. He pulled a gun from his waistband, leveling it at Henry's chest. "Gray warned you, Whitman. You should have listened." Madeline's blood ran cold as she stared at the gun, her heart hammering in her chest. "No!" she cried, struggling to get to her feet, but the man's companion grabbed her, holding her back. Time seemed to slow as the man raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Madeline's mind raced, and her body screamed with helplessness. This couldn't be how it ended. They were so close, they had come so far. Suddenly, there was a deafening bang, and Madeline flinched, expecting the worst. But when she opened her eyes, the man with the gun was staggering